What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my final review for the original Avernum trilogy as I continue to move through the CRPGs made by Spiderweb Software. With this one in particular, I must say it was a very ambitious title. It's aiming to do a lot of things. Some were pretty cool, other things I don't think landed quite as well, but before we dive into all that, to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. There's a link below covering everything I go over, and my Steam profile is public and linked below as well. With that said, though, we are here to, of course, talk about Avernum 3 Ruined World. So, for those who are just clicking on this because Avernum 4 is coming up, which is the reason I've been taking a look at the trilogy recently, it's probably worth a quick mention to know that the Ruined World version here is a remake of a remake. The Avernum series actually started out as the Exile series in the 90s. That was remade and expanded upon with the original Avernum trilogy. And then that trilogy was also remade via Avernum Escape from the Pit, Avernum 2 Crystal Souls, and now Avernum 3 Ruined World. Being an indie title, the gameplay and stuff does not change dramatically from game to game. Most of them play pretty much the same, but there are some notable differences. For starters, this game sees changes to the UI that make it a little more user-friendly and easier to mess with, the addition of things like ground effects in combat, and some other small tweaks. So there's a little bit to talk about there, but mechanically it really doesn't change that much from its previous entries. However, what it does try to do is change things up on the narrative side of things, the way you are systemically interacting with the open world you'll be discovering, because this time around we are on the surface, and the surface is under siege by various plagues. These plagues advance as the game goes on. There is actually a day counter. At certain milestones, individual places can be attacked. This can cause certain locations to fall and be abandoned. There are NPCs that will move around the map, that kind of thing. And while most of that is really cool, one issue this does cause is that because there are so many locations, because the world map itself is so big, a lot of them are just really light on meaningful interaction. While there are a couple dozen settlements, only a few of them are actually packed with content, and some of them have as little as 0 or maybe a single quest to offer you because they're kind of just there as filler or for the sake of being attacked by these monster plagues. And I would say that's probably the weakest part, where it feels a little more shallow. And yet, on the flip side of that, as it closes out the trilogy, you kind of see the end of a story arc that's taken place over 3 games, which was really satisfying. Suffice to say, some good and some bad in there. But first, let's talk about the technical state. How is this game running? So, Avernum 3 Ruined World is relatively recent, released back in 2018 originally, which means you're unlikely to run into too many problems. In fact, I really didn't have any issues at all, other than the fact that I play and record on a 4K monitor. These games were not really made with 4K in mind, and as a result of that, they tend to not completely fill the screen there very well, and you'll almost certainly have to adjust the settings. That's been the case for all 3 of these games. The second one, for whatever reason, just did not want to work at all. I struggled to get that one to actually work on a 4K monitor quite a bit. In the case of 3, though, what I wound up having to do was just turn it down to 1080, which pretty much solved the issues. Other than that, though, and willing to play around with the resolution and stuff, I'd be surprised if you had any real trouble running this, given both the system requirements being very, very low, as you could probably tell by, just looking at the screen, alongside the fact that it's had plenty of patches and things, and it's not terribly complicated in comparison to anything that releases today, for sure. I always like to talk about difficulty with these games as well, but it's important to note that this game, just like all of the other remakes and everything, and I think the originals might have had it as well, it comes with the character editor. Basically, while there isn't a dedicated respec or anything in-game, what you can do is turn the character editor on and, switch things out as you please, completely rework characters. And so while you have difficulty of basically casual through torment, so like easy, normal, hard, and super hard, you also have this character editor that would let you max out anything independently of that as well, which is all to say the game is as easy or as difficult as you would like to make it, especially if you've played the other 2 up to this point and you're kind of familiar with how the combat system and everything works. And maybe it's that exact experience that leads me to say that I honestly do think this one was a bit easier than the previous two. Mainly because you just have so much content and things you can do to, get experience and everything that it just was significantly easier to overlevel the sort of like main content. So not a terribly difficult game, frankly. Next up, let's talk about party creation. This is essentially identical to the second game. We can pick from humans, Slith, or Nephilim, or humans, lizards, and cat people, each with their own bonuses and whatnot. The Slith have a huge bonus to pole weapons like halberds, polearms, that kind of thing. And humans get an extra trait every few levels, so they can get really powerful really quickly. So those are certainly all things to know. Now, in my first impressions video for this title, I mentioned that I was a little sad to see that the Vanitai from the second game weren't included as a playable race. And I have two more things to say on that. The story makes it pretty clear why they were not included, but also that when I mentioned it, people were talked about how the Vanitai were an underground race, and I agree it doesn't make sense for them to live on the surface, but there's nothing, especially considering their magic, stopping them from going up there, which we actually see in the game. We encounter a large quantity of Vanitai on the surface, so I would say that this is likely a story decision more than anything else, which does make plenty of sense. But before we move on to talking about the story a little bit, character creation otherwise is setting up your entire party of 4 teammates. You'll be able to, pick out their sprite, what you want them to look like as they traverse the world, but also then their starting setup. You can pick from a preset or go with the custom. I've been going with custom because having played the previous two, I kind of already knew what I wanted to do here, but nothing terribly complicated. Now, from there, let's talk about the story setup and my thoughts on it. Now, a quick note on spoilers. This is the end of an official trilogy with a story arc, and as such, I do have to talk about the events of the previous games in order to even set this one up, which I am about to do. I'm not going to spoil it in its entirety or anything in case anybody wants to run through these ahead of the launch of 4 the same way I did, which is a separate trilogy to be clear, but still. So let's get into it a little bit. Basically, Avernum 3 finally sees the payoff of what we've been working towards for the last 2 games, where we helped the kingdom of Avernum down in the caves establish themselves only to fight a war against the Empire who threw them down into those caves to begin with, and now at the start of the third game, Avernum is ready to actually make its way back up to the surface and try to carve out a section of the world for them to live in peace now that they are no longer stuck in those caves. However, that's made a little bit more complicated by the fact that everything is not well up on the surface world. There are a variety of plagues of monsters attacking individual sort of districts or zones within the open world of Avernum. The Empire has proved inefficient in combating these hordes of monsters and has largely retreated to keep the core of their power base safe while not really being able to do much about the actual plagues themselves. So our party of adventurers get sent up as like a second or third string detachment of people who have been sent to the surface, and our job is basically to get to the bottom of why these plagues are happening, what we can do to stop them, while also trying to find a place for the Avernites on our way. Overall, I think it's a pretty good time. So basically the way this is structured is that each province or zone is divided up into a various monster plague. You're going to get to the bottom of that monster plague and what you can do to actually stop it, while days are passing and the plague itself is advancing. Now the catch there, as you'd probably expect, is that as you are doing that, you uncover that all of these plagues are connected, and you have to perform an investigation to get to the bottom of why this is all happening, and that kind of forms the crux of the story as you close out this story arc. Overall, I thought it was pretty good. There is actually a sort of investigative element to it where you genuinely do have to track down who did this. And while it will eventually be told to you directly, this can affect things like you creating a weapon to help you with this adversary. And if you choose wrong in a few conversations, you can actually make some of the in-game significantly harder by not giving yourself the appropriate tools to make it easier. Like, for instance, there's someone that can help you out if you choose to accept their help along the way. It's also possible to craft a weapon to fight said adversary, but you have to know who it is in order for that to be effective, just as a couple of examples. So there is some actual investigative element to this, but it's not terribly complicated, and there will come a point in the story where they just outright tell you. So there is certainly that. Overall, though, as a close to a trilogy, I thought it was a lot of fun. I think it does actually wrap up the story here quite well, and I'm curious then to see the next trilogy, Avernum 4 and its Greed and Glory remake, come together and continue on in this setting, because the Avernum 4 remake is actually a remake of just the Avernum 4 game, which was made after the initial Avernum remakes. So they just kind of expanded things. So curious to see where it goes. I've heard that one was people's least favorite. Either way, though, pretty fun game. Next up, let's talk progression. This is almost identical to the second game as well, with a few new extra things, namely in the form of new traits, because there are a lot of abilities and stuff that added ground effects to the game, which we'll talk about. Otherwise, though, again, pretty much identical. You're going to level up by gaining experience from completing quests and killing monsters. This is going to give you the ability to increase your attributes alongside your skills, which increases, of course, how good you are with a variety of things. These can be divided up into your main combat skills, both melee and magic, and then your miscellaneous ones, which include things like luck, nature lore, lockpicking, etc. Now, the miscellaneous stuff, that is to say the non-combat oriented perks or skills, they are across your entire party, so it takes the cumulative number there. Now, in the first game, you actually had a problem where the requirements to hit those checks were so low that the party-wide effect was irrelevant. We saw that rectified a bit in 2, and it's very on display here, because each individual character, which was true in the past games as well, does have a cap on how much they can invest in those non-combat skills, like 10 per, basically. And I think luck can only get 5, if I'm not mistaken. But this means that in order to hit some things that have a check of like 15 to 20, you're going to need that spread out on multiple characters or from equipment, things like that. It is possible to get it without too much trouble, but it's something you're going to want to know about. In addition to that, every few levels, you also get to pick up a trait, which is a passive bonus of some sort that just increases how effective your character is. Other than some new traits, again, all the same system for the most part, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. The rest of progression largely comes down to gear, and as we are in the third entry of the first 2 games, most of the equipment is largely the same. That is to say, the same pieces and items and stuff, and while there is some new things, especially in the form of the legendary artifacts, which there are 5 of that you can find across various optional dungeons, gear is what you would expect. In order to sort of offset things like encumbrance for mages, you have to have the appropriate, like either traits or melee skills to back that up, otherwise they won't be able to use their magic. The problem is heavier armor also reduces your chance to hit, but pouring points into the melee skills offsets that, allowing them to use that heavy armor more and more. So it's a balance of providing yourself with the most amount of armor and effects while also making sure you can actually still use your abilities. From there, though, let's move on to the gameplay and world section. So, Avernum 3, like the previous entries, is an open-world game for the most part. You're going to travel across a very large map. What is a bit different, though, is this time we are in the surface and not the caves of Avernum, which means that map we are exploring is very different. It's also very large, which means we're going to have to figure out means of fast travel, such as, for instance, there is a location that will allow you to just teleport places. You'll also eventually get an item that teleports you back to your main sort of hub of Fort Emergence, which is where you're going to turn in all your information to as the plot progresses. And there is a small section of Avernum known as Upper Avernum that you can explore as well, but it is very small in comparison to the previous games, and it's like the equivalent of a small zone. Now, while you are doing that, exploring, interacting, trying to get to the bottom of all these plagues and everything, time is passing. There is a day and night cycle, and there is a day counter. You basically have 160 days to complete the main story before a big event happens that will, if you fail it, just lose the game for you. If you succeed at that event, you can then continue on, of course, to complete the main story afterwards. Now, the thing is, though, that 160-day counter is pretty generous. My first run doing absolutely everything, while also doing it pretty inefficiently because I was kind of trying to learn where everything was, only took me about 110 days. So you've got more than a little bit of time to actually work with here. But again, even if you do hit that timer, it just means you have to have a big battle that occurs, and if you can sort all of that out and win that sort of encounter, or scenario, if you will, you'll actually be fine and can continue playing. Now, in service of that, though, as you'd probably expect, things can change as time passes. This can be more dramatic stuff, like everything going on with some of the towns that can potentially get sort of destroyed or attacked and everything. But it's also less dramatic stuff, like, for instance, some NPCs actually travel between towns every few days, which means where you find them might be different on occasion. There's even a house you can buy this time around in the town of, I think it was Lorelei it was called. And the game even has a very early version of like a Radiant quest system. So there are both the static missions from a sort of notice board, but there's also a job board which will give you Radiant missions that have a timer of a couple days to do things like deliver messages or take on bounty contracts, that kind of thing. And then, of course, there's all just the general exploration, secrets to find. Based on your skills, you might encounter like secret passages, secret caches, or just, find generally explorable dungeons, or perhaps a small town will give you a quest to go explore said dungeon that isn't otherwise going to pop up. The issue I have with this, because while it is actually all pretty interesting, especially for the scope of what this CRPG is, though, is, as I mentioned towards the beginning of the video, a lot of it is just kind of fairly shallow. There are several dozen small settlements and towns you can explore, but some of them are only as big as like 4 buildings, and they offer you sometimes no quest at all, or interactions even, or sometimes as little as just 1 quest, and sometimes you can even complete it within the confines of that single village you found yourself in. So it's got a lot of really cool ideas, but unfortunately there's not a lot of depth to them either. Now, in addition to all that, there are actually some factions you can join as well. There is a Thieves Guild you can find. There is a faction called the Anima, I'm not exactly sure. But these guys are effectively priests that will take your ability to cast magic, while at the same time instead pumping up your ability to cast priest spells for a very specific run. Honestly, though, given how strong magic is, it's not something I would want to give up for any length of time, really. But I thought it was an interesting choice. These guys just hate magic, but have no problem with the divine rituals, which fuels the priest's magic spells and abilities. So even there's some interesting world building, and as a sequel would, of course, typically come with, we can also see how a variety of characters from earlier in the series have gotten on what they're doing to try to establish things up in the realm of Avernum. But the other thing I wanted to mention here before we move on to combat is actually the mirror puzzles. So a lot of the more interesting content is unsurprisingly in the big main dungeons that house each individual plague and of course all the main story related stuff. However, a lot of these dungeons and even some of the side optional dungeons use what I would describe as a mirror puzzle, where there are these lasers on the ground that will shoot around and then you have to find and use mirrors to direct those lasers to where you need them to be, and I really didn't enjoy most of these. However, it's not the puzzle itself in most cases. The puzzle is usually fine. The issue is actually specifically moving the mirrors around. This game just doesn't have like the precision of control on your movements that really is required to make something like that feel satisfactory, which means a lot of times you have to basically turn on the game's turn-based mode in order to make that happen. And even then, it's just not always a fun time. And it doesn't help that one of the big places that this mirror puzzle stuff happens in is the Golem Factory for one of the plagues, and that place does a really bad job of explaining where you need to go for all these, and it utilizes this stuff the most. And I found those individual dungeons that used a lot of these particular puzzles to be very annoying for that specific reason. That does bring us to combat, though. Combat has, again, remained mostly the same from the previous entries, with the big new thing really being ground effects. There are a few new abilities and like spells and stuff that will, of course, apply these ground effects, and enemies, of course, make a lot of use of them as well. This can be things like, of course, fire, burning, that type of stuff. There's even some ground effects that will allow you to like bless the ground, and then you'll get a buff for going onto it as an example, but otherwise it remains mostly the same, and the same old strategies from previously can work here as well. You've basically got your melee fighters, which can be things like dual wielding or using all sorts of different types of weapons, sword and board, pole arms, that kind of thing. There are also archers and ranged characters, which like the previous games are okay, but tend to fall off compared to both the regular melee as well as magic users. Magic users are divided up into priests and actual mages, which have their own different sets of skills and the like. Probably should have mentioned this in progression, but just like earlier as well, there are 3 ranks to basically every spell you can learn, with 2 of them being available from a trainer who teaches it, and then the last one being available by earning a rank out in the world somehow, typically by reading like a skill book as an example. So all of that is the same, it's just, a few more spells and things here and there. Actually, in combat, it is a turn-based action point system. You have 8 action points by default, and you can use those to move and attack. But the catch is, attacking will generally end your turn, so you usually want to move and then attack as you end your turn, but this can be circumvented in a few ways, by casting things like haste or the quick action skill, or abilities like Adrenaline Rush. Adrenaline Rush is why you want to put 15 points into melee skills even for mages at some point, typically because this gives them access to Adrenaline Rush, and Adrenaline Rush can allow you to make up to 3 attacks in a turn or cast 3 big AoE spells, which is devastating on enemies. Other than that, you've just got to watch out for things like various debuffs. Charm in particular is a brutal one, which is why, of course, you want to do things like increase your attributes and whatnot, and certain skills will give you natural resistance to those effects as you level up, as always, but there are also spells to get rid of them as well, which is where the bulk of the combat system lies. There are certainly some new enemy types and things here and there, but by and large, if you've played the first 2 games, you know what to expect from the combat system at this point. And the new stuff is relatively minimal, so it's probably not going to blow you away or anything, so there is that. But that does bring us to the Steam Deck section before we start wrapping this up. So the Steam Deck is certainly a way you can play this game. It has an official rating of playable. Obviously, the Steam Deck's hardware is more than capable of running this game. The issues you're likely to run into are things with the resolution, like I mentioned earlier, but also stuff like the incredibly small text on screen, and the fact that you have to pull up the keyboard on occasion to do things like, say, name your saves as an example. Now, if you're willing to do that and also adjust the controls and everything, you can absolutely get this working on the Steam Deck. However, it's probably not the type of game I would enjoy playing on that particular platform personally, just because of how the game works and operates. Definitely more of a PC title in my opinion, but again, it is certainly possible. Which brings us to the positives, negatives, and then we will wrap this thing up. So, on the positive side of things, it's an ambitious game for sure. There's a lot of systems here in terms of how you interact with the world, the fact that it has even a little radiant system for quests. For a CRPG that looks the way it does, and with the very original version of it, Exile 3, going all the way back to the 1990s, there's an impressive amount of systems here, and there's clearly an element to that that has stood the test of time, which I would say is proven by simply the fact that I'm making this video. It's also really fun to see that story arc close out in a really satisfying way as you get to the bottom of all these monster plagues. So while they didn't exactly reinvent the wheel or anything, there was a lot of effort put into expanding what those CRPGs were trying to do, and I think that's pretty obvious when you play it after having played the first 2. The negative side of that is, though, that unfortunately a lot of that does wind up coming across pretty shallow. You've got all these little towns that just have nothing going on in them, or at most one quest. And that's almost certainly to do with the monster plague system, but then it's hard to really care about these individual settlements because there's nothing really going on there to begin with. There's the fact that you have to mess around with this mirror puzzle stuff quite a bit across the game, and it, again, just isn't really the type of game that gives you the precision of controls to make that interesting. Or easy to interact with, even. So, to sort of draw that to its natural conclusion, I would say Avernum 3, on one hand, is a really ambitious game. And unfortunately, just not all of those ambitions, I think, really panned out. And in that way, I would honestly say that I probably prefer the first 2 Avernum games. And while it's enjoyable to see the story arc close here, and I do still think this was really enjoyable if you enjoyed those previous 2 games, I just couldn't help but feel like this just was not as engaging as those previous 2 games were, in large part just because of how generic and shallow a lot of the locations felt in comparison. Now, with all of that said, though, Avernum 3 Ruined World full price is $20. You can regularly find it on sale for much less. In fact, you can buy all of Spiderweb Software's games often in a bundle for very cheap, and you can even buy the Avernum trilogy specifically bundled together for less often as well. In fact, you can buy all 3 of them for under $20 very often, so it's not exactly like it's difficult to get access to these games or they are particularly expensive. With that in mind, I think Avernum 3 is not quite as good as the first 2, but still a pretty satisfying conclusion to that original trilogy. Now, looking forward a little bit, when Avernum 4 rolls around with the remake's release, I believe still slated for the end of 2025, but no release date, so I don't think 2026 is out of the question. But when it rolls around, I will, of course, be diving into it. But when it comes to Avernum 4, it is my understanding that that one tended to be people's least favorite, and the remake of it is going to significantly expand content in it, so it'll be curious to see how much I enjoy the kicking off of the second Avernum trilogy. But for today, I think that's pretty much going to do it. Certainly hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. I'd love to know what you think about this one down below, and of course, if you're looking forward to the release of 4, certainly stick around, as I will be obviously reviewing that one as well. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.